Hello, this is Dread, and in today's video topic is going to be the 0 to hero run for the Chaos Bolt Bleed Rip Blood Abusing Warlock. So, the concept behind this build is to abuse the node called Blood Tithe, which reduces the cost of Chaos Bolt significantly, but adds a hefty life cost and ward cost to the skill. Now, normally, this would be really bad, as consuming your life is a terrible idea. I'm sure you can tell in the footage that my life is going up and down like an accordion. Well, turns out you can bypass most of this if you utilize a few different mechanics that I'll be talking about later in the video as I'm making the build. But trust me, I'm a lot tankier than you think I am. Let's put it like that. So one of the other things that I'm abusing here is utilizing the interaction between Bone Curse and Rip Blood. So there's a node inside Bone Curse that makes it so that Rip Blood, whenever Bone Curse times out on an enemy, you cast Rip Blood on them. Now, this doesn't sound like that strong for a moment, but realize if you Bone Curse 20 enemies and the Bone Curse times out on all 20 of them, guess what? You're getting 20 casts of Rip Blood, which is very good considering that Rip Blood can have 2 extra explosions on top of it, which means you are pretty much like overlapping constantly on trash, and it makes your clear a lot better. The reason why this is so important is because Chaos Bolts, it may be okay for single target and may be okay for clear, right? But the biggest problem is as it's in the name, it's very chaotic and not very consistent in terms of its clear. Like sometimes it'll clear everything, sometimes it won't hit anything. That's because of the way it randomly shoots out. But this Bone Curse interaction that we're utilizing is enough to make the clear plenty consistent, like very, very consistent actually. And good, great, right? Now, if you are not new to the channel, if you've been around for a while, you'll know that this is actually an interaction that I've abused in the past with a Rip Blood Necromancer. This is like the perfect example of why I play bad builds. Dread, why do you play bad builds? Because you get to find diamonds in the rough like this one, because we utilize tech from other builds. Like, for instance, I'm using Font of the Erase on this build. I've played plenty of builds that utilize Font of the Erase that weren't necessarily what I would call the best build ever, but this build abuses Font of the Erase to the absolute extreme, right? This build also abuses the Rip Blood Bone Curse interaction that I was exploring with a completely different build, the Necromancer, right? And that build wasn't necessarily the best build ever, but turns out when you take all of these little tech pieces from across different builds and you combine them into one really giga good build, it makes it very strong. So yeah, that's why I play bad builds, is so that we can find good builds like this one. Now, if you haven't already, I would heavily suggest leaving a like on the video and subscribing to the channel, as that is the best way of currently supporting me, and it's the best way of showing that you want more content like this. Also, as well, I stream on Twitch, so if you go down in the description, there'll be a link to my Twitch where you can follow me and catch me live if you want to see me play these builds live, or ask me questions about Last Epoch or Last Epoch related questions. Now, with all that being said, let's start the 0 to hero run, shall we? Character select. We're going to be doing a Warlock this time. As you can see, I'm trying to get past the censor bar in Last Epoch. It's going to be funny having someone watch this video 5 years from now and have no idea what I just put in the bar there. But yeah, we're going to be starting as a Warlock. Unfortunately, the uber early game is a little annoying as an Acolyte, as you only have access to Rip Blood and Summon Skeleton, but we make do with what we have. When you get access to Wandering Spirits, the build feels way better because Wandering Spirits is actually a really good skill in general. Unfortunately, they keep nerfing it, and I can't use it as a main skill anymore, but Wandering Spirits is still pretty good. Acolyte definitely has the most varied leveling experience because leveling as a Necromancer and leveling as a Warlock are 2 completely different experiences, as having access to Chthonic Fissure is completely different to just being a Necro and being forced to use zombies or something like that. Acolyte definitely did not grow up in terms of power creep in terms of their leveling process. If you were to ignore Chthonic Fissure, there's not that many ways of safely and strongly leveling an acolyte that is in any means comfortable, especially if you compare it to like last episode's glacier leveling. But thankfully, if we're a warlock, we can ignore all the bullshit and just level with Chthonic Fissure. Here's me killing Respec's Orion. As you can tell, the overlaps on the Wandering Spirits does a big job in terms of doing plenty of DPS here. Those nice juicy overlaps. I do want to point out that grabbing the Avarice gloves is probably a good idea while you're leveling a warlock, as you can scale ignite chance on the tree and on gear and abuse Chthonic Fissure and try to get a decent amount of leech thanks to the Avarice gloves. This will carry you until you can get to the warlock node that gives you just generic percentage leech. Most spell damage based builds with Acolyte are trying to rush that node so you don't have to use Avarice anymore. As you can see here, though, the overlaps on Wandering Spirits just absurd, just absolutely absurd. Early on, make sure to try to go for an item that has like percentage chance to ignite or bleed or whatever. That's mainly because Wandering Spirits, the way that we're leveling with it right now, is we're using the node that makes them shoot poison darts at enemies, and that will apply our ailment chance. So if we have a 100% chance to bleed, it will not only apply a poison, but it'll also apply a bunch of bleeds and stuff like that. And that allows us to clear stuff in the early game and do plenty of single target. And now here we are with Chthonic Fissure. Being able to get it so early now helps out so much, as all of the other acolyte skills are definitely what I would call lacking for early game progression, right? Like, for instance, Rip Blood really doesn't start getting good until much later. Same thing with Bone Curse, Spirit Plague, Wandering Spirits. There's all these skills that are just absolute juggernauts in the end game that don't really affect much in the early game. And that's a interesting topic in general with Last Epoch, where base skills themselves, like skills at their base, aren't very strong. It turns out there's only a few that are, like, for instance, a good example. Transplant is good at base because it teleports you. Same thing with, of course, aforementioned teleport. Uh, those skills are good at base without a skill tree. Flame Ward is good without a skill tree. There's a few that are good without skill trees, but what ends up happening is if you don't have like 10 plus points in a skill tree, half the time the skill is like dog poo, like in comparison to like what else you have to offer. Like, even Chthonic Fissure at base is so much better than like most of the repertoire of Acolyte early on. And remember, you don't get that many in skill points. It's not like as if you have Hammer Throw where you press like one node and all of a sudden you triple your single target DPS, right? You don't have access to anything like that. Now, this is where Chthonic Fissure gets really good, when you get access not only to ignite chance on hit on your weapon, but you also get access to the double fissure. That, both of those combined, just lets you mop up enemies very easily, turns you into an effective walking simulator, like most people enjoy, right? That just helps so much. It's just so fucking good. Now, you could actually go a spell damage route and use like a spell damage weapon. The biggest problem with this is your early game sustain is going to suffer, especially in the mid game in like Act 3. That's like the biggest problem with not utilizing the Avarice setup, is you get to Act 3 and you start dealing with like poison enemies and stuff like that. That's usually why I advocate for utilizing an Avarice setup early on in general with most builds, because of the fact that Act 3 exists with those like Hydra poison areas. And all of that means that you need a really good sustain to maintain that. And that's why it's such a big ask to make sure that you don't just fucking instantly die. Like, just having some leech is like phenomenal. Now, of course, here's the end of Act 2 boss. Very easy. Just put a bunch of dots on the enemy and we're good to go. Not really that hard. Just stack as much ailment chance as possible and you're good to go. Now, this is the act where I start deviating. I start getting items that I would call not necessarily easily to get on a run this early on. But it turns out when you're constantly checking your, what do you call them? Your nemesis guys, and you're also killing loot lizards on the way, sometimes you just get absurdly lucky. This build is not going to be what I would call replicatable in early game, right? As I drop a few uniques that are going to carry me very soon, as you'll see. Like, for instance, I already have access to Morning Frost, which just turbo boosts the early game, being able to move through stuff like so quickly, right? But I just want to let you guys know if you're trying to follow the leveling process of this build, don't do that. There are plenty, like a myriad of warlock leveling things on YouTube though. So, and I doubt this is the last time I play a warlock anytime soon. So, yeah, just keep a lookout for another Zero to Hero episode where I don't get absurdly lucky. Here it is. I get a Torch of the Pontifex. If you don't know, Torch of the Pontifex gives you like 160% ignite chance, like a bunch of fire damage over time percentage as well, and it also gives you the cremate thing. Yeah, this run immediately became unreplicatable because of Torch of the Pontifex. Do not try to level exactly how I'm leveling here. But I realized since I have a torch, I'm like, well, I can just speed through the early game very quickly, ignoring things, just zooming. And the reason why torch is so strong with, of course, Chthonic Fissure is because there are nodes that spread your ignites on hit in Chthonic Fissure, like whenever you torment an enemy. That in combination with, of course, the absurd ignite chance you end up getting because of this, it makes your early game so much easier, like so much, so much easier. To give you an idea here of how ridiculous Torch is early on, here's Hearten. As you can see, that ignite number is climbing up really fast already. Like 30 ignites for literally almost no effort whatsoever is absurdly strong. As you can see, we're just chewing through his life bar like it's no tomorrow. Really satisfying, really satisfying. And this is why I tell people to make sure to check your nemesises and stuff, because you can end up with a unique like a Torch of the Pontifex, which completely changes your leveling run entirely, and you can lean into it as well. Torch plus movement speed boots plus avarice is plenty enough to get all the way to endgame and probably through your first monolith, to be honest with you. Now, this is the zone I was talking about why avarice is so important is this specific zone. If you are not prepared in terms of sustain, like you're taking heavy physical damage from the blood asps, you're taking heavy poison damage from these hydras, right? But as long as you have a good source of leech, it is not that big of a deal. Just having any sort of sustain early on just helps immensely in this zone. Otherwise, this zone is absolute cancer AIDS. Now, of course, we go over here and bully the twins real quick, and we're done with Act 3. As is tradition on the channel, we're entirely skipping Act 4, as it is probably the easiest and quickest act ever, to be honest with you. Now, here's some footage of our first monolith with Torch of the Pontifex. Uh, like I said, I went into monoliths really early, and as you can see, Torch is just cleaning up as Warlock has plenty of ignite support to make Torch work very early on. Just the massive amount of damage that you get access to a Torch makes getting like into monoliths early on not that big of a deal. And it really did carry the build early on so that I could focus on more important things like going into our respec. It's kind of funny because I didn't even have a build in mind at this point. Like, I knew I was going to be playing something Chaos Bolt related, and I knew I wanted to abuse the Rip Blood tech, but I was not entirely sure how effective it was going to be. I thought it might brick, to be honest, because I've bricked a few Warlock builds in a row at this point. But turns out I found a diamond in the rough. Okay, here's some footage after the respec. The whole concept, like I said, apply Bone Curse to something, shoot them with Chaos Bolt, and then move on. Now, I did make some changes after this point, which I'll explain later, But essentially, the idea is we're utilizing Illusion of Pain with Bone Curse to remove the Bone Curse immediately and time it out so that each enemy applied with it gets a Bone Curse on them. So if you see those like blood explosions, those are Rip Bloods going off. And turns out when you have like 20 of them going off, it is an absolute spectacle. Now, Chaos Bolt itself does plenty of damage itself. Like I said, it's just like I said, chaotic. You can't rely on it too hard for clear, but turns out you can definitely rely on Rip Blood plus Bone Curse, and it kind of shores up that weakness that Chaos Bolts innately has. And of course, for single target, we just plop down a Chthonic Fissure. Now, you can see my life pool going up and down, and that's going to be important for later discussion as we'll get into it. So as our A-bomb kill goes on in the background, let me explain what's going on in terms of the sustain. So there is a node inside Chaos Bolts that dramatically reduces the mana cost of Chaos Bolts, called Blood Tithe. But the problem is it makes it so that whenever you cast a Chaos Bolt from either source, from like, of course, Chthonic Fissure or self-casting it, it consumes like 60% of your current life. That is a lot. Also, 9% of your current ward. But we can get around this by utilizing Rip Blood. Rip Blood grants you like 30 flat healing at base, gives you 4% healing effectiveness per point of intelligence, and then 5% more per point of intelligence. So we end up getting like 400 flat life per Rip Blood, and we can actually proc it 4 times per second on a boss utilizing Chaos Bolt's innate ability to proc Rip Blood, and we also as well, of course, proc it from our Bone Curse reaction. Now, of course, this source of sustain on top of Leech is plenty to keep us topped off. As you can see, my life goes up and down, up and down, up and down. It's really not that big of a deal. We also abuse the early game strength of the relic, of the offhand. I can't remember the name. It's the ward one I was talking about last episode. I was glazing it, but utilizing one of those just ends up giving you just so much ward early on, and that 9% current ward consumption isn't really that big of a deal with Chaos Bolts. As you can see though, we're just mopping up shit, and it's just so satisfying watching, like, being able to like place a Bone Curse on something and watch just the entire pack just delete itself. It's so satisfying, and it never gets old. It never gets old. Although the only problem that I found was, out of all of the builds that I was playing so far, this is the only build that required me to shut off my browser while playing. It was very obnoxious because what was happening was it was lagging way too much, but I turn off my browser, all of a sudden I'm just fine because it's just using that much CPU. And it's like, well, Dread, it must be your browser. You should get a better browser. No, this, like, I've been playing PoE 2 with my browser open and multiple things open and OBS open. Like, it's not me, it's the game. Now, this is where it gets really spicy. So we get access to a ring called Font of the Erased. If you don't know, it is a unique ring, a Weaver's Will ring, that makes it so that based on our missing mana and our missing health, we gain ward on hit. Turns out that is absurdly strong when we're constantly missing mana because Chaos Bolts is an expensive skill. We're constantly missing life because Chaos Bolts is an expensive skill, and we always want that ward because, helps us maintain our life pool. So what ends up happening in the end game is if we are missing life, we have ward. If we and then what happens is, since we're gaining that ward, and then we leech back or we sustain back with Rip Blood, that extra ward that we generate ends up as a surplus. So us sacrificing our HP to get Chaos Bolts ends up being a massive upgrade and gives us a lot of ward generation. Now here's our raw boss. As you can see, my life going up and down, up and down, up and down, but my ward number and my leech is enough to keep up with it. So throughout this video, you're going to watch me do a bunch of bosses in a row, and you're going to watch my life go up and down. Now, you're probably going to think, wow, Dread, doesn't that seem a little precarious, especially with the Harbingers? Turns out, no. You have so much sustain as this build that it ends up just not fucking mattering. It literally does not matter. You gain so much HP. Like it's just absurd the amount of sustain you get per second when you do it this way. Like it doesn't matter that I'm constantly consuming 60% of my life every single time I cast a skill. It literally doesn't matter. Turns out doesn't matter. Although I will say for the squeamish of you, this would not be what I would call a hardcore friendly build because there is always a chance that the boss hits you the instant you consume life but not get life back, to be fair. Now, to give you an idea what I was talking about in terms of lag, here you go. Ah, beautiful lag. So much lag. Like I said, turned off my browser, not a big deal. Turns out the bleed calcs that I'm doing takes a lot of effort on a last Epoch's end. Like I said, I've played Pee-wee 2, not a problem. Played Elden Ring, not a problem. Played Cyberpunk 2077, not a problem. Last Epoch, my computer fucking dies. Finally, we're back to visiting our well-endowed friend. Got to check up on his little penis farm, right? Now, like I said, this looks crazy. Like you're like looking at me, you're like, hey, Dread, you must like be so close to death constantly. Your life is going up and down. It doesn't fucking matter. It literally doesn't fucking matter. It's so funny how it doesn't matter, man. It's crazy how I can consume so much life but end up being so tanky in the end. Like, you know the ward loop builds in like Path of Exile? That's kind of how I feel right now with this setup. It's just like, oh yeah, you know how like I took a hit? Well, guess what? I'm instantly back at my max HP. Because remember, as you can see with my ward number, the moment I am at any reduction in mana and I have any reduction in life, I'm instantly at my HP cap in terms of ward, and we're good to go. Then I heal back up with Rip Blood, and we're good to go. And it's just so satisfying to watch. Now you must be wondering, well, Dread, your mana doesn't go down that much, right? Well, thankfully, EHG has an fetish to make sure that every skill in the game costs absurd amounts of mana. And thankfully, Chthonic Fissure is one of those skills. So, thanks to the fact that Chthonic Fissure costs so much mana to keep up, that it actually makes Font of the Erased way more consistent. Because we're always missing mana when we're playing builds like this, because for some reason, EHG really hates low mana cost skills. Now, of course, we also fight Mr. Emperor Daddy here, having an unspec'd Profane Veil on her bar, like I was talking about before, where like most skills unspec'd aren't good. Well, Profane Veil is one of the major exceptions, as being able to dodge anything is crazy. Profane Veil is very good. Um, am I the only one that gets a little spoopy scared when he starts doing the melee attack animation? Because it never like hits with your hitbox or anything like that, but it always ends up hitting you for some reason. Like I'm always spooked out when it comes to that. But as you can see, our damage scaling is good to go. Okay, here's our first 90 monolith, and this is when I realized that I was being stupid the whole time. So I was streaming my character up to this point, because I stream most of what I do, and turns out there was a friend of mine, Antez. He's the guy I talk to whenever I have Warlock brews because he does a lot of Warlock. And it turns out you don't actually need Illusion of Pain. Illusion of Pain adds a cooldown to your Bone Curse, which is really obnoxious. And the reason I had to utilize it on, of course, the minion version of this build with Necromancer is because I only had Marrow Shards to remove the bone curses on, of course, the minions. Now, turns out uh, Chaos Bolts, when you have all the projectile nodes, you hit with 8 of them. That is enough to start the chain reaction if you only have the node behind it, acute awareness or whatever it's called. Essentially, what this does is it makes it fall off only after 4 hits, but it doesn't add an absurd amount of cooldown to the skill, which means we can cast Bone Curse as much as we want while clearing, shoot out a Chaos Bolt, and it ends up feeling way better because of that. Now, for a quick Spirits of Fire, really all not that complicated. Chthonic Fissure actually splits the damage, like it will spread the damage to all three of them, technically, like the bleed stack. So you don't really have to aim too hard with your Chaos Bolts as long as you're hitting one of them, and all three of them should die very quickly because you're doing damage to all three of them at once and applying bleed stacks, which will then propagate, and like you'll be good to go at that point. And of course, a quick Heorot as well. The level 90 bosses, they've been kind of power crept a little bit in general in terms of what tools we have access to. They usually don't survive that long as they don't have that much health. I would say maybe a million health or something like that, if I were to guess, somewhere around there. As if you have any build that does a decent amount of ticks, it's not that big of a deal, right? Uh, what's really cool about Heorot though is as we're waiting to kill him and when he's invulnerable, we can still apply ailments. So by the time he comes out of invulnerability, like he'll just take absurd amounts of damage. Also, as well, his invulnerability does let his boss ward decay as well. So Heorot actually is one of the more balanced bosses in terms of boss ward, which is kind of funny to think about. But yeah, Heorot dead very easily. I just wanted to show you guys a little bit of snippet of gameplay here. As you can see, the bleed, rip blood shenaniganry is going off. It's really funny just watching just a gigantic amount of just I'm just gonna call it what it is. It just looks like a bunch of jelly on my screen. Whenever you get like the bleed fountain stuff going, where you get multiple rip bloods going off, it's just so satisfying. And then you combine that with the aesthetic of fire, bleed, like chaos bolts, and then the blood, like chthonic fissure. I feel like an edgy 16-year-old who should be at a Metallica concert, and I fucking love it. It's great. Uh, the only problem we have early on, though, with this build is this build doesn't really start popping off in terms of the single target until we get all of the points on the tree for Chaos Bolts, because you need pretty much all the points. So here's the first Harbinger. Now, one thing I will note, the single target on this build isn't going to pop off early on. What do I mean by that? Well, there is a node or a set of nodes inside Chaos Bolt that reduce the targeting area of Chaos Bolts. So as you can see, whenever I shoot the Harbinger with my Chaos Bolts, it doesn't like necessarily hit him always, right? Now, you can actually fix this by scaling some AoE on your gear while also scaling the negative target area on Chaos Bolts. The problem is I only have a level 20 Chaos Bolts throughout the entirety of filming of this video, so I never get access to the negative targeting area. But once you get access to like maybe a +4 Chaos Bolts, like you could do in trade or sometime in COF, or you can get just plus levels to spells in other ways like a Nihilus or something like that, right? That would allow you to grab that negative targeting area, and that would actually boost our DPS significantly. Another thing I want to note as well before we kill this guy is there's a node inside Chaos Bolts that gives us like 1% more damage with dots on Chaos Bolts per missing life that we have. Since our life is constantly jumping up and down, and whenever we cast Chaos Bolts, it actually consumes our life, we actually end up getting a decent amount of more damage from this node. Now we can do our first empowered monolith. As you can see, our scaling is good enough. Turns out with enemies that have much larger hitboxes than the Harbingers do, you end up killing them way faster. That's like one of another problem the build has, is it's a lot better on enemies that have bigger hitboxes because they're chaos bolts. They're not as erratic when the enemy has essentially what is regarded as a dumpy. So yeah, generally when you're playing this build, once you're done getting your initial playset of blessings and stuff like that, you want to focus on bosses like, of course, Reign of Dragons to make currency, and like farming Twisted Hearts and stuff like that, and the Harbinger of War, which is like, well, not that, Harbinger of Destruction, yeah. because they just have very big hitboxes, and it makes it so that your chaos bolts always hit the same target. Now, uh, I looked into the DPS a little bit later once we actually have some gear and stuff. We were peaking around 200k ticks, which is pretty much as respectable as you can get early on with ailment builds. Like for how little effort it takes me to actually do my DPS rotation, it's actually pretty nice because we don't even cast chaos bolts that often. Eventually, like I said, once we get that reduced targeting area, it would make the build significantly better for single target. And thanks to the fact that we're utilizing Rip Blood for clear alongside the Bone Curse thing, we don't have to care about reducing our target area at all for reducing our clear, because it doesn't matter, because we want to actually just clear with Rip Blood instead, right? As you can see here, I'm doing a little bit of a dance with all the freaking stupid Scalebane saboteurs. I hate them so much, but they used to be way more toxic. So I guess I'll take this version of them over the last version, which was actually ball busting. As you can see, with enemies that are smaller hitboxes, it's not as easy to kill them as quickly, and we'll see this as a running theme with the build. So I wanted to show a little bit of the Lagan footage before we do the Harbinger here, and the main reason why is because turns out one of the bigger problems that you end up having with this kind of build is because of the way that your EHP is, where it's constantly bouncing. We're a lot more, what would you call it? We're easily stunnable. So we can actually probably eventually get like stun threshold on gear on like a few different places, like stun avoidance on pieces of gear. It's actually very easy to stack a respectable amount of stun threshold as long as you just get it on your belt and your amulet. But here we go. Here's the Harbinger here. This is by far the worst Harbinger of every single playthrough. Harbinger of Chaos. Very fitting considering we're playing Chaos Bolts. But I'll be honest, with this build, I didn't have that much of a problem with it. At least not normally. Of course, I have to play a lot more carefully, dancing around Lagan's penis like that. But it's nowhere near as bad as I normally feel. And I think that's because of our just massive giga sustain. Like I said, I know it doesn't seem like it. It physically does not look like as though we have that much sustain. But like as our, HP is jumping up and down. But like I said, what ends up happening is by the time the boss hits us, we have so much like sustain that it doesn't matter. Like we're back to instantly full. So as long as we're hitting the enemy with our chaos bolts, it's not a big deal. And you can see that as I face tank some waves and stuff like that. Like I'll take damage. Like I am taking damage. It's not like as if I'm blocking damage. I don't have dodge or anything like that. Like I'm taking like I think 500 damage hits from these waves, and it doesn't matter because guess what? I just have that much. And what's cool right now, if you don't know, with Font of the Erase, with the one that I have right now, we have about like 20 ward on hit. So if I use my Chaos Bolt, which hits like 8 times, and you have like, of course, Chthonic Fissure doing a bunch of hits, right? If I, every single time I click the button on Chaos Bolts, it gives me like, I think 80, I mean, no, not 80. It'd be like a 160 ward per click. And that's just a lot of sustain. Like life gain on hit is very strong. Like like there's not that many builds I can use. Like look at there, I took a 1k hit from the Harbinger and I just shrugged it off like it was nothing. Like that's like why I like this build so much, is because of the chaotic nature of the HP and how I built it properly. Turns out it's not that big of a deal. Also, as well, of course, we gotta talk about Rip Blood. Rip Blood giving us just a massive amount of HP per per Rip Blood, because like we're doing like 4 Rip Bloods a second right now on the boss, which is giving us plenty of healing as well. Here is our first Oribus. As you can see, lots of the Chaos Bolts going around and not actually hitting Oribus because he's got the smallest ass this side of Missouri. And the biggest problem is, since we can't get access to that target radius, the negative target radius on the tree, it's going to be like this. Because I believe, if I'm not mistaken, if we get the negative target radius, it would also apply to the Chthonic Fissure negative target radius as well. We're also missing like Chthonic Fissure like frequency as well. We're also missing a lot of uniques. So this is something interesting. So we are actually not immediately going for the Harbinger push. That is because I am farming for the shield, the unique shield from A-Bomb called Flare's Pride. It gives us a very large amount of percent bleed chance and also bleed effect, and just gives us some decent defenses as well. We're mainly looking for it for the bleed effect that we currently don't have. Now, remember when you're doing something like this to uncheck the Harbinger, like the Harbinger lure node, like the thing, like when you press the boss thing and like it pops up, it's like uncheck that box. Otherwise, you'll end up wasting one of your attempts at Harbingers with him. You don't want to be fighting this Harbinger early on because he's actually absurdly easy. You want to be fighting the light Harbingers first, unless if you're confident with your build's ability, of course. So what's interesting about farming for some loot early on instead of immediately going for the Harbinger stuff is it actually lets you push corruption in a way that allows you to manipulate it a lot more. Later on, I'll be showing you guys, but essentially you can manipulate corruption a lot more than you used to be able to. Like for instance, I can push one monolith to 300, go to a different monolith and push that one to 300 with the Oribus catch-up mechanic, like instantly, and then go back to the previous monolith, reduce my corruption so I don't have to fight the Harbinger, like the light Harbingers on a harder difficulty, right? And it just kind of lets you like ping pong throughout the entire monolith system and allows you to maintain the high amounts of stability gain that you get at 300 corruption while also not having to deal with the Harbingers at higher corruption. Because what you can do is you can actually fight the you can do corruption at like 300 for the most of the playthrough and get a lot of stability, a lot of experience and stuff like that, and a lot of loot, and then reduce the corruption later once you have the stability already, and then fight the Harbinger, right? This ends up being significantly more efficient in terms of time because you end up farming more content that's worth it, and you also end up with more favor for other things. So I think that's the way I'm going to be going from now on. So for this, we're trying to find some unique relics. That's because I'm trying to find a Valder's Chalice. A Valder's Chalice would give us not only bleed duration, it would also give us a lot more chunk while clearing, because we end up applying a bunch of bleeds and then we'd gain a bunch of life on kill. All of that would lead us to have a much smoother playstyle while monolith farming. And here we can see we have the Mesembria lenses, we have the relic one, and we have the dungeon one. I mean, the arena one, because I do not want to farm arena at all. Like, arena sucks dick, but I don't mind dipping into a dungeon real quick and killing some rares and shit, right? That's fine. But like trying to actually kill like going into the arena of champions is absolute dog water and a waste of time. So normally I wouldn't use my favorite this early on, but normally on trade I would just buy a Valder's Chalice. So this is effectively the same thing, right? So we're just farming for a Valder's Chalice here while I'm also farming for the shield. You can kind of like multitask like that, and it's really nice with the prophecy system how you can multitask like that. And it makes me enjoy COF enough that I would think about maybe starting COF on a season sometime. Definitely not the next one though, because I like trade. I did manage to get a Valdir's, and usually with these runs, I don't spend that long trying to find a good base for them. So I just slam it with whatever I can, and I end up getting a shitty roll, but who cares? It's intelligence. I actually didn't talk about it too much, but intelligence stacking is the name of the game for this build because most of our sustain is coming from the constant rip bloods that we're triggering on enemies. And that is very important because if you have like, let's say 50 intelligence, you can end up with like, I think like 400 HP per rip blood, like globule or whatever you want to call it. And that is like why we can actually face tank a lot of boss abilities is because of the fact that we can just simply instantly get our HP back. And of course, you'd also want to eventually farm up and get a lot more HP with this build, as well as the more HP that we have, the more ward that we can have. Eventually, you want to have double font to the erase as well. Like, there's a lot of other things you could do to improve this build. Don't do what I'm doing here. You actually want to actually remove your mana. You want to like kind of like spam Chthonic Fissure and remove your mana. But there we got a Flare's Pride. Here's our third Oribus at 150 corruption. As you can see, our damage is significantly higher than before, and that is because of the fact that we got a Flare's Pride and a Valder's Chalice. The next item on our list currently is just looking for anything with just fizz percent damage and intelligence. That's mainly what we want. Dam chance on our helmet, bleed chance, and of course, like bleed duration and bleed effect. Normally we would use Blood of the Exiles, but we don't really need it right now. Now, here's the third Harbinger. Something I noticed actually is turns out this fight is nowhere near as long when your abilities can actually target enemies. It's crazy how effective your build can be when you can actually target enemies. But here is the first of many harbingers. What I do, like I said, is I push up to 300 corruption and then I reduce it later to fight the harbingers at less of a difficulty, just for just time's sake in general. Like I don't want to spend forever fighting bosses when I'm trying to like do 10 out of 10 harbingers. Like this specific harbinger does not drop anything of like of worth. Like that's the problem with some of these harbingers is they just don't drop items that I would necessarily want, if that makes sense. Like this one doesn't drop anything crazy. Like if I'm like trying to remember, like there's no item I would actually want to grind on this guy, like at all, to be honest. Although the shield is pretty good, but the shield is pretty non-meta, if that makes sense. And it's really easy to grind out your own shield as well. So it's not like as if you need to like farm this and sell the shields to other people, right? As you can see, we take out the worm on the right side, as I've learned. Then we take out Hearten himself. Now we can do the Harbinger of Treason. Now here, this boss actually went a lot easier than I thought it was going to go, and that's just because we just have enough sustain that it doesn't matter. Now here we're just kind of like I am dodging their attacks, but I'm pretty sure I could face tank most of them. The only reason I end up dodging their stuff is because I'm just used to doing it at this point because I'm used to playing worse builds, to be honest with you. So it's just kind of funny watching me like dodge all this stuff, knowing that I could face take most of it and not have a big like not have that bad of a time. Now, one thing I do want to note while we're here is I do want to talk about the possibilities of playing this on a lich. A lich version of this could actually function pretty well because instead of utilizing Chthonic Fissure, what you can do is you can have Hungering Souls alongside your Reaper form and stuff like that, and your Death Seal, and get like a massive amount of more damage. And in theory, that could work very well. I just didn't want to do Reaper form mainly because like I'm pretty sure they're going to change it here soon. As you can see, our damage scale is pretty high when we actually get to, do damage to the Harbinger of Treason, and pretty good, pretty respectable for early on. Yeah, pretty good. Speaking about DPS, I actually did a DPS check. We get around to like 140k ticks on the dummy, and I think that this is misrepresenting our DPS significantly. And the reason why I think that is because enemies end up having much bigger hitboxes than the dummy does. And I think the size of the hitbox of the enemy is very important in terms of our damage scaling. This is why that negative target percentage is so important later on, is it makes our DPS on Oribus and stuff much higher. But that's like why our DPS looks a lot higher when we're actually killing things versus like when we're just hitting the dummy like this. Also, as well, we're missing a lot of uniques and shit like that still, right? Like we don't have a Bloody the Exile, we don't have Salt the Wounds. We're missing a lot of things. Now, here's our Harbinger of War. Like I said before, pretty easy just to kind of face tank his abilities. Not really that big of a deal. I did not feel like as though I was in any danger whatsoever, although my hubris did get me a few times, mainly because when you get crit, you'll obviously die. Like there, I'm pretty sure I took a 1700 hit, either 1700 or 700. I'd have to replay the footage, but like I'm letting myself get hit by the Harbinger pretty easily. Like it's not that big of a deal. Like it's crazy to me how a build like this where you are constantly consuming your life uh doesn't feel that bad because of Font of the Erase. Now, do I think Font of the Erase is overpowered? I don't think it is, because I think it's a huge build around item. You need to have very specific kinds of things going on in your build. Like you need to have a build that hits often, can sustain low mana without needing to, go to high mana as often, and also as well have missing life all the time. And I don't think that's like very easy for most builds to get. Here's some more clearing footage here at like 230 corruption this time. As you can see, just applying bone curse to everything and just watching everything erupt in a blood fountain. Always so satisfying. I'm never gonna get tired of this kind of build archetype where we just abuse rep blood. It's just so satisfying, and I'm so happy it's in the game. Like it's just oh god, just watching just all the fucking blood explosions. It's just like ugh, it just like I don't know. It itches some kind of like feeling inside my soul whenever this happens. It's like, yeah. And being able to use it on a build as strong as this just feels great. Uh, yeah. Anything else I can think of while we're here? Not really. Pretty much the build's going great at this point. So, as per my last video, I realized that my ranking of the Harbinger difficulty was a little bit off, mainly because I was putting Harbinger of Ash higher than like one of the light Harbingers. I found that the light Harbinger, the one in the what is it called? The Soul and Lance timeline, that one's actually significantly easier than this Harbinger, mainly because he does a bunch of AoEs on top of you and shit. But I did learn some new knowledge about fighting this guy. It turns out he actually puts that necrotic dot thing on top of you, meaning that if you actually know his patterns and know when he's going to do things, you can actually manipulate the position of the necrotic dot aura that he puts down. This is absurdly important because moving him is obnoxious, but moving, of course, the area is nowhere near as obnoxious. So, what you can end up doing is if you're having a lot of difficulties with this guy, is you can stay at range, wait for him to put down the necrotic dot aura, and then get in melee range with him, which makes it very easy to dodge most of his abilities, right, and face tank them. Like I said, the biggest problem is just simply the necrotic dot aura on top of the explosion as well. That necrotic explosion that it does does actually a lot of fucking damage, like that necrotic mortar. But here you go, the ash hole's down. Now, at this point of the footage, I'm pretty sure this is when I learned how to do that corruption jumping that I was talking about earlier, where of course we jump to 300 instantly, and then we go out and just do all our harbingers real quick, and then reduce our corruption and abuse the extra stability gain at 300 corruption to get our 10 out of 10 harbingers way quicker than normal. And so pretty much the rest of this video, for the most part, is just going to be doing a gigantic boss like kill rotation. So we're just going to kill every single boss in a row and do completely fine. Harbinger of Pride here, like I said, I realized he's actually the easiest out of the light ones. He's way easier than all of the other light ones, mainly because the arena. It turns out his insane mobility is not that big of a deal when his area, like you can actually dodge around him. When you have like the Lagan arena, for instance, he gets significantly more difficult. And I believe that in the beginning, when I first started fighting these guys on the patch dropped, I thought these guys were absurdly difficult. But now that I know that it's actually not the Harbinger itself, but it's the arena, it's a lot easier. And I've learned what kind of stats and how much sustain I need to be able to like face tank these guys much easier, so I can build around it more easily. Yeah, Harbinger of Pride is down. Speaking about 300 corruption, here's some footage of it. Our damage is a little lacking, but that's just mainly because I don't have access to Blood of the Exiles yet. That would help our clear immensely, because the idea is we would bleed them and then have them flawless, and they would take more damage, and we'd apply more bleeds, yada yada yada. But what's really interesting about this build is the clear gets better the more enemies there are on the screen, mainly because of the Rip Blood shotguns and stuff like that. Because remember, every single explosion on Rip Blood, it will hit all the other enemies around it. So if you have 3 enemies around, it'll actually get hit by like maybe I think like 7 hits at that point, and that's plenty of bleeds for clear. Obviously, they're not that strong of bleeds, but you end up with so many bleeds that it's not that big of a deal. One thing I keep forgetting to do though with this build in general is to abuse the range factor on it. Speaking about that, there's actually something interesting I've noticed with this build in general is if you are right next to the enemy and try to target them with Chaos Bolts, you end up missing a lot more Chaos Bolts than you normally would. So there's this kind of like weird spot where I'm kind of sitting right there in that footage there, where you kind of want to stand a little away from him, not too far away from him, but you want to stand like a maybe like a penis's length worth of like length. I don't know, like however long you would assume that would be, just kind of not exactly humping his leg, if that makes sense. You want to like be like just a mid, like, because I've noticed you end up hitting a lot more when you do that because so if you use your cursor as the center of the chaos bolt thing, it kind of shoots forward a little bit more. Like it kind of shoots in a line a lot more than it shoots out in an AoE. Because you would assume that with the way that it works, it would shoot out in a circle, right, around it and like the targeting area, but it ends up being more of an oval, I've noticed. So you definitely want to like kind of get away from him a little bit. Now, I've actually noticed this Harbinger, I used to hate it a lot, but I realized uh, if you stay at range against the Fat Harbingers, they don't use their really obnoxious Void dot attack. That's actually the hardest thing about the Void Harbingers is the Void dot attack that they do. And being able to ignore that entirely helps a lot. All right, we're just going to skip these boss fights because they're not really that impactful. So Harbinger of Tyranny is dead. And now Harbinger of Defilement, also dead. I found actually is with him as well, is you want to stay at range. It helps a lot. Turns out just abusing your range. Another problem with melee versus range builds, right? And now we have the 10th Harbinger. So I'm going to let this play in the background while I talk about my overall thoughts about the build. So my ratings, I would say S tier clear. The Rip Bloods just make your clear so much better. I know it takes 2 buttons to achieve this. You have to press Bone Curse and then you have to press Chaos Bolts, but you end up casting so many Rip Bloods. Like your clear potential is technically infinite because of the fact that it scales with the amount of enemies. So if you Bone Curse 20 enemies, that's 20 Rip Bloods that you get. Now, what's really interesting is if you were playing a build that didn't rely upon the blood orbs that you would get from these, right? If you were playing like a different build, you could actually get the on kill effect where you do rip blood on kill, and that could lead to even more satisfying explosions. But I obviously couldn't take advantage of that with this build because I really wanted the life sustained from rip blood. But yeah, so cool. DPS single target, it's I would put it at B tier, mainly because it requires specific uniques. First things off, it's bleed. So bleed has this reputation where it is very reliable. It's a very reliable ailment. You will always do enough damage with bleed. It is very hard to not do enough damage with bleed, but you're never gonna do like absurd amounts of damage with it. Like you're never gonna like impress your friends with the damage, but it's always going to be there. And bleed is actually the preferred ailment for a lot of different builds because of this fact, because they don't have that much like room to invest into damage. And it turns out if you just put on some really nice bleed uniques, you can have good bleed DPS no matter what, right? So that actually lends into the more chunk factor. So being able to, of course, do enough damage is like, in my opinion, raises it to a B or an A, in my opinion, in that regard. Like the like the amount of investment is nowhere near the amount of like reward that we get for it, if that makes sense. Now, survivability, I would put it in a solid A tier. So the reason why I don't put it in S tier after glazing over it the entire time is mainly because of the fact that stacking HP is just hard in general on an acolyte. You're not going to get like 7,000 HP or anything. That's like when this would start really popping off, right? But generally, you'd want more HP. So here we are in game with the character. Let's go over it like I usually do. So for skills, we have Chaos Bolt here. Chaos Bolt, mainly the nodes you really care about is Blood Tithe. Blood Tithe reduces the mana cost significantly and allows us to actually sustain our mana properly and not actually like consume our entire mana bar every single time we press our right click, right? And of course, as well, to take advantage of this, we grab 3 out of 4 of the extra projectiles from Chthonic Aura. We would do more in this, but we're running out of points, so I only put 3 in here. Then we have 2 points into Exacted Libation. This is to make it so that we can get up to 4 Rip Bloods per second. This helps a lot. So this is a lot of sustain, and it makes up for the reduced all the health consumption from Blood Tithe. Then we also grab another affliction to give us extra bone curses. Then that also allows us to get into Devour the Damned, which gives us mana hit against Kurt's enemies. And this, on top of all of the other reductions that we have, is enough to make our mana neutral without having to like use other ways to generate mana. Then also as well, we grab as well a Grave for 2. Must be wondering, why are we actually running this considering we're like, playing a life build and not like a low life build? Well, it's because we're consistently reducing our life to gain, reducing our life constantly with Blood Tithe alongside Chthonic Fissure. So we're losing life all the time, which makes this just really effective for damage scaling, especially since we're scaling HP. Now, like I said, if I had +4 to Chthonic Fissure, Chaos Bolts, I would grab Destructive Intensity. This would give us a lot of reduced target area per sec. We'd get up to like 48%, which would mean that we could actually hit singular targets much easier. And eventually as well, we could scale AoE as well on it, as well on our gear and stuff like that, which would just make our consistency of damage go up through the roof. That's something you would eventually want to do. That's pretty much it for Chaos Bolts here. Now, our second skill here, like I said, Bone Curse. Bone Curse, most important thing is getting Crimson Enlightenment, Rip Blood on Bone Curse timeout. You want the Bone Curse to time out, and then what'll happen then is you'll cast a bunch of Rip Bloods everywhere. So we grab Acute Affliction to make the Bone Curse fall off instantly once we hit them, mainly because our Chaos Bolt hits that many times. This would not be viable if we weren't using Chaos Bolts, but since Chaos Bolts hits like 7 times per click, it makes Acute Affliction a lot easier because you only need to reduce the amount of Bone Curse on one enemy, because after what happens then is if we hit one enemy and reduce it with Bone Curse, our Rip Blood will go off, and that will be an extra 3 hits, and that will like hit in an AoE, of course, and that will trigger all of the other Bone Curses as well. So we want to at least hit 1 or 2 enemies, and then that will proc the entire chain and make everything go off, which is great. And that's what allows us to not have to run Illusion of Pain. Illusion of Pain sucks, so it's nice not having to be forced into Illusion of Pain. Transplant, stereotypical tree, nothing too crazy. I do actually go for a little bit of missing mana restored on it, mainly for the fact that sometimes we do run out of mana, so having just a little bit of extra sustain is great. Then Chthonic Fissure here. Mainly what we're doing here is we're focusing on trying to get as many Chaos Bolts as possible. This also means that we can also grab as well, we could grab, what is it called? The extra Chthonic Fissure frequency, like the Spirit frequency on our chest to end up with even more Chthonic Fissures later on. Of course, we get the double fissure for even more spirits, right? It does cost a lot of mana, so that's actually good for us, like I said, and before, is because we want it to consume mana so that we can actually reduce our mana for our Fonts of the Erase to make them effective. And that's pretty much it for the Chthonic Fissure. Now for Rip Blood, we only care about 2 things. We care about the AoEs, the Eviscerate and Splatter, these to give us a bunch of AoEs. We want the area on those AoEs so that they shotgun easier. And then we also want to grab the Quenching and, of course, Hematology. Because of the amount of intelligence that we're stacking right now, we end up with, like, right now we're at 30, so it'd be like 60, and we're getting about 300. No, like, yeah, around like 300 life per Rip Blood, and that is an immense amount of sustain, considering that we proc it 4 times per second. We proc it as much as possible on enemies. Just Rip Blood is like the thing that makes this build tick. And that's pretty much it for the skills. Let's talk about the passive tree that is important. So for passives that are important, of course, Bleed Chance, getting that ward on death as well helps our clear out, makes it feel a lot better. I'm actually grabbing the flat armor here. We actually have a decent amount of armor currently, and that is thanks to nodes like this. It gives a lot of flat armor. We also have flat armor inside a Warlock as well. Try to get as much armor as possible in general because you just want to be tanky, right? Other things we grab is like Cauldron of Blood for the global bleed chance as well. Bleed Overload, which gives us 15% more physical damage over time to bosses and moving enemies. Lots of extra damage. We do actually grab Soul Stealer as well to give us even more mana sustain. This on top of all of our other mana sustain is enough. We don't have to have too much mana regen, which is great on our gear. Like, cool. Wither stuff, of course. We actually grab Dam Chance. The whole reason why we grab Dam Chance is because of the fact that we actually convert Damned into Bleed Chance for our Chaos Bolts, and that allows us to actually scale our damage even further, thankfully. Then, of course, the haste and stuff like that, the cast speed. That's pretty much it for Warlock. Now, with the last of our points, what we probably end up grabbing is Serrated Bones. That's pretty much it for the passives. Now, let's talk about our gearing and stuff as well, and our blessings. So, Void Res or Crit Multi, once we get access to Salt the Wound, here on Ending the Storm, we just want Lightning Res, Bleed Chance, of course, from Reign of Dragons, Armor, and then Armor percentage as well. And that's pretty much it for the blessings. Now, let's talk about the gearing. So, things that you would eventually want but aren't mandatory. Eventually, you'd want a Flayer's Pride, that comes off of course, if you don't know, comes off of the Fall of the Outcast boss in Empowered. Then as well, Valor's Chalice. This just is, you just have to use Runes of Ascendance or use your prophecies to get. Either way works. This is a slightly rare item, but is definitely worth going for as it makes us feel a lot better. Blood of the Exile is just nice movement speed, nice intelligence, nice strength as well. Remember, if you have strength, that also gives you percent armor. So that's why Blood of the Exiles are so important for builds like this. Of course, like, that's pretty much it for uniques that you might want eventually, but like aren't mandatory. Things I would say mandatory: start using your Runes of Ascendance on rings early on. Getting an early Font the Erase at like level 30 or something just massively improves performance on any build that hits enough, because it's oh god, it's so good. Font the Erase, I can't glaze over it enough. That's pretty much it for uniques. Now let's talk about the rest of our gear. Here we got Dam on hit, HP, Bleed Pen on a decent base. Pretty happy with that. Of course, instead of that Vitality, though, we'd probably want Bleed Duration or something like that. Amulet here, Fizz damage. Eventually, you want Crit Multi there for Salt the Wound, then Resistance or HP, and then Frailty Sealed, of course. Weapon here. This is like pretty much what we'd want, except instead of that fire damage percentage, we would want Crit Multi. Instead of that health on kill, we would want Fizz Pen, but like otherwise, good to go. We want Crit Multi, of course, for Salt the Wound eventually, because you do want to move into that. Then chest here, Bleed Duration, Dam on hit, Fizz Pen are this is actually a pretty good base for a chest. Just don't have this base. Like this, the mods on the chest are good. Don't have this base. Have a much better base, obviously, right? Shield, like I said, Player's Pride, Fizz Dot, the dot res HP on a silver ring. Can't really go wrong with that. Belt here, Fizz damage, HP eventually on the Praetorian belt base, or the coin mail base, as it gives us a lot of armor percentage, like I said. Gloves here, dot. Eventually, you'd want cast speed. Cast speed is incredibly important with this build. You want cast speed on your gauntlets, and of course, your Valor's Chalice eventually. The reason why we care about this so much is because we don't actually use cast speed on our weapon, and we need cast speed to scale our damage on single target, unless if you're only going to use Chthonic Fissure for single target, but I think that's a waste of time. You definitely want some cast speed. So eventually, Salt the Wounds with cast speed would be good here. Like I said, you want to move into Assault the Wounds eventually, but you do that later on when you have a better budget for the build. And that's pretty much it for the gearing. For idols, you just want 4 adorned idols with the HP and then dot if you have ailment overload. And or you can go with damned on hit and bleed. Although there's a problem here, the bleed on physical spell hit, I'm not entirely sure. It does say physical here. For a while there, it was not saying physical. It was like bugged out. So yeah, it is saying physical. Okay, so we're good to go then. These are like either these or these, either of those. This lets you be tankier. This gives you probably more damage in the end. And that's pretty much it for the build. That's pretty much it for the video. With all that being said, this has been Dread. I'll have to go do something else. Bye.